language and the importance of whatever that pipeline is that you decide for your show, is to agree on it and make sure that everyone in the chain has the same information, so you know you're looking at the same things. But sometimes...
And oftentimes, that last little bit, that last little 10% that you need on effects is the difference between people believing it and not. I remember when James Cameron previewed, I mean, he had like 10 or 15 minutes, I think, that showed in IMAX of Avatar. And the internet lit up with, oh, it's Thundercats, and it's fakey looking, and blah, 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 blah. And like 3 months later, he had been able to do that last 10% in all those shots, and everyone was suddenly fucking silent. And it was like he had a chance to finish it. But if you look at the things from that IMAX thing, you can see them in the trailer. You can see the finished shot versus the shot 90% finished. And that last 10% of dust in the air and little tiny things that this process makes more evident is the difference between being, you know, mocked at by the Twitterverse and you know, having a totally convincing vision.
No, it's very, very true. So we have to take it though, and having this common pipeline, whatever it is really important. And Michael, you've talked about that doesn't have to always be the answer. So ACES is definitely a solution and a potential pipeline to do, but you're saying that it actually could limit some filmmakers. And
I'm unfortunately getting over pneumonia, so I have to, I'm not contagious. But
Thank you.
But I have to speak slowly, which for those of you that know me is uncharacteristic. Brad made a point, actually a phrase, that I had never heard articulated, so I'm gonna wanna borrow it. And that was, the technology is overperforming. Remember him saying that? That's a really good point, because when we have technology that's overperforming, that means we have less anxiety because we're further away from the limiting edge, right? And we need to have technologies that overperform. For example, we want everything to need a little bit more than you really have to use, right? When you go on a trip, you want to have more fuel than you actually need to get there. When you're going to make ingredients for cooking, you want to have more ingredients than you actually need to cook it. As we go into the holiday season, if you are trying to get through a lot of uncomfortable family dinners, you might want to drink more than you actually need. And so HDR, ACES, Dolby Atmos, these are like buckets that we don't have to fill all the way to the brim. And that is technologically freeing. That should be creatively freeing, because we don't have to go to the edge. When we were working with SDR before, we were often at the limiting edge of these formats. From film negative to digital negative, we were always kind of bumping up against the limit. And one of the letters not found in HDR that I find people think is there is the letter B. HDR is not bright dynamic range. But for some reason...
Yeah, that deserves a round of applause.
It doesn't mean bright dynamic range. It means that we have the ability to work in high dynamic range, and you control the throttle with how bright or dark that should be. And this is really important because what people may not clearly realize, and I hate to be too technical, and usually I have slides for this, so I apologize, but light is exponential. The way light physically works is exponential. So the distance between 1 stop, 2 stops, and 4 stops is the same difference between 1,000 nits, 2,000 nits, and 4,000 nits. That's how exponential values work. So when people say, I don't need 10,000 nits, sometimes they forget that 10,000 nits might only be 3 stops more dynamic range. It's not 10,000 times brighter than 1,000 because it goes 1, 2, 4, 8. So this is how the exponential world of light works. So what I encourage people to understand is, one, we don't have to be limited to hitting these nit values because of some expectation. So it doesn't mean bright dynamic range. But as televisions and even projectors increase in their ability to display more dynamic range, that's what I tie back to Brad's comment, that the technology has to be outperforming. Creative people need the tech to be ahead of the vision so that the vision doesn't have to be held back. It doesn't have to be reduced or dubbed down or canceled or down converted, right? We want to constantly be striving more. And so I actually believe in a 10,000 nit future, not because I want something too bright, but I want to have the option for making 1,000 look great, and it's nowhere near the boundary line. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely does, absolutely does. You also had a great analogy about workflows, where you talked about the fact that you like to be able to build the proper pipeline to finish these shows so it actually can achieve the goal creatively, technically. And you talked about, you did an analogy with transportation that you may remember, that I won't steal your thunder, but I thought it was very, very poignant, and it really does demonstrate the point of how you finish content so that it can meet the expectations creatively and technically.
Well, many people know the name Leon Silverman, and while I like to think I'm mentored by him exclusively. I think he has like 5,000 mentees, so that's kind of disappointing. But Leon was probably one of the early people to coin the phrase snowflake workflow. And it's the idea that every workflow is unique, right? Now, I like that. Some people loathe that. And I personally see opportunity in unique workflows. And the analogy simply is, because we live in Los Angeles, we understand that not only are there many ways to get from one place to the other, you're better off if you know all the different routes, so that you can avoid all the problems that are going to happen and you sort of find your own unique way to get there. If you travel on the same road as everybody else, it's congested and it's limiting. And you may not be discovering things. You may actually take more time to get to the same place that someone took the other roads because they knew the territory better than you. And so I find that the more snowflake workflows that I engage in, the more routes I learn along the way, even if the same destination is the goal. So let's say we have a platform, like Disney Plus launches this week, we have a platform. If there's 75 productions all delivering to the same platform, we have the same end goal. But it's okay that there are 75 different paths to get there. I would argue it's ideal to take 75 unique paths to get there because we are all different personalities. The filmmaking community is not a machine, it's people. And so the more we can educate ourselves, and everyone here is doing the right thing because we're talking, we end up discovering new territory so that when we get to the end result, we can look back at the route we took and identify what would we keep, what would we lose, what would we change, and how can we do better.
All right, so Paul, you have to now gather this all together and you become the collector and deliverer of all this content as heading up a post team. And you have to, what are the things, you were one of the first companies through Marvel Television to actually deliver HDR. How has it changed for you and how you communicate with your content creators?
Well, I think as both Brad and Daryn were saying, it's all about prep. It's always all about prep. It should never be fixed in post. It should be fixed in prep. And making sure that people are educated to what HDR can provide, what its challenges are, what people need to look out for. We talked about the water bottles in the shadows, or cables that are in the shadows, tape marks, anything from makeup, how that looks, backings, translights, are a huge issue because what people have been using for years on standard definition and HD now look like a piece of plastic's hanging outside the window. And sometimes you can see them move. They just don't look right. So, we insist that we shoot tests for lots of things, which in the television world, we don't always have the time for that. Production doesn't always want to spend the time for that you might have in features for doing tests for, whether it's backings or makeup, prosthetics tests. So we don't end up fixing, so we can make sure that everybody can see it before it goes to camera and knows what it's going to look like and work to solve those problems ahead of time. And it's also about making sure that our showrunners who are coming in, most of which haven't worked in HDR before. So we try to keep them from first time they go in the color bay looking at it and feeling like they're on the stage, light shining at them, because we have had showrunners that completely embrace it, think it's fantastic. Other ones who say, I don't even want to look at that monitor. I want to look at what I'm used to. And it takes, you don't want them coming in without the expectations of what they're going to see, because they've been looking at it on imperfect monitoring, in DNX files and editorial on pics, and now they see it this beautiful HDR picture. And again, some of them, are quite surprised and are a bit taken aback. Others just think it's the best thing ever. And also, DPs who I think, again, it's been amazing the embracing of HDR just over the last few years and how many more people have experienced and have worked in it now. But the DPs and post-producers that we work, I was a post-producer myself for years and was introduced to HDR, and it's a bit of a learning curve to get up to speed on the complete change in post workflow that you have to deal with. And we've also had DPs who love to embrace the testing of it, and they want to spend a lot of tests and shoot different things. And then other DPs who go, yeah, I've been doing this for years. I know how to I know how to like this. This is going to be fine. And then meanwhile, they're shooting episode 5 or 6 and coming to their first color session for episode 1 and go, oh my God. So we try to make sure they shoot those tests and learn about what the process will be and what the ramifications will be and the advantages downstream. So that's what we spend a lot of time doing.
You talk about testing, and this is something that continually frustrates me. Well, you come down on Tuesday, we're going to do a hair and makeup test and some lighting test. Great. And what are we doing Wednesday? Oh, we're going to shoot the first episode. And it's like, well, okay, when you guys shot film, what did you do with the film after you shot it? Did you process it? Did you print it? Testing in a digital environment does not mean looking at the monitor as you're lighting it. When you do a test, in my opinion, it needs to encompass the entire post-production pipeline, the whole workflow. You need to see it go through dailies and see what happens to the stuff that because all we're doing is we're feeding this big machine that stuff comes out the other end, but it's not just staring at the monitor going, okay, let's go shoot, let's go shoot after, we'll test in the morning and then we'll go up and then we'll start, we'll do a little splinter unit after lunch. It's like, well, what's the point?
Yeah, what if something was wrong? You have no time to recover or make any changes.
And you don't know what you've got until the whole process is complete. I'm not going to say that generally that means, and preferably, in the place that's doing the work on the project. So you need to get, in their work queue, and you need to somebody's got to get some material there. It's got to get picked up. It's got to be viewed somehow, preferably in a good environment. And like you all said, it takes time.
You're not testing the acquisition, you're testing the whole ecosystem of, a shop.
Wish I said it like that.
Well, yeah, and I think that comes down to, too, we talked a lot about monitoring on set as well. So as far as we know, as a team, like if you're on a big movie or a big television show with a big budget, if you're going to get a true professional HD monitor, if they aren't going to be available for rent, I mean, that can be a $30,000+ investment. for a show, which is not necessarily affordable to put 200 of those in your visual effects house and 10 of them on set and 5 in editorial. The testing process, at least all the department heads could actually see what it was going to look like and have an understanding ahead of time of what the constraints are.
But what you don't want to have, we talked about the value of overperforming. What you don't want to have is overkill in adding. It's like adding people to a meeting. If a meeting with 10 people is usually a pretty good thing. But if it starts to be 100 people, then it just gets like, oh God, shoot me now. And I mentioned in our discussion, there's an analogy to non-linear editing. When it first got developed, people were thinking, well, it's great because you can go anywhere in a movie, it'll speed up the process, and we'll get our cuts quicker. We'll be able to explore, but what it did was, for a certain segment of the community, is it allowed an indecisive director to have 10 different cuts. And maybe we could do 5 more different cuts. Because I don't know, this one's better this way, but this one's better that way. And it just makes, it ceases to become a useful tool, and it becomes something that delays decisions. And that's not what you want. And there's a tendency, when you have new Gugas, to use it to delay decisions rather than to enhance decisions. And I mean, I'm stating the obvious, but I think that there's always a danger when you have new technology for that reason.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And most of which is people aren't seeing it on set. I mean, the HDR moderator on set is pretty much, especially in the world of television, not being used. So the first time people are seeing this is in a color bay once it's done and close to delivery. So again, that's why it's great to do the testing, because of the finances of it, and it's very difficult to do that on-set monitoring. So you really need to make sure you're shooting a proper negative from the get-go, as always sort of the case, and that'll get you where you need to be.
All right, well, we can keep going, but I know that there might be some questions from the audience, so I want to invite, does anyone have a question?